My name is Thea Lawson, and I'm 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my mother looked me in the eye at my grandmother's will reading and said, "You were always her least favorite." She said it in front of 14 people. My father, my brother, 2 lawyers, family, friends, and she smiled while she did it. My parents had rewritten my grandmother's will the night she died. They split her $2.3 million estate between themselves and my brother Brandon. I got nothing, not a dollar, not a mention. But what my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandma Eleanor had been planning for this moment for 7 years. And when the lawyer opened a second envelope, the number he read out loud changed everything. Before I tell you what happened, if you enjoy stories about family, justice, and standing your ground, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely like this story. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? This is how it started. I grew up in Westport, Connecticut. If you know the town, you know the type. Old money mixed with new ambition, country clubs, and the kind of neighborhood where people measure each other by square footage. My father, Richard Lawson, ran a small commercial real estate firm. My mother, Diane, ran everything else: the social calendar, the dinner parties, the image, and my older brother, Brandon, was the one they built it all for. Brandon was 4 years older than me. He joined Dad's company right out of college, started closing deals by 25, and by 30, he had his name on a corner office door. Every holiday, every family gathering, every single Sunday dinner. The conversation orbited around Brandon, what Brandon closed, what Brandon was building, what Brandon would inherit. I became a teacher. 3rd grade public school, Hartford. I loved it. I loved the kids, the chaos, the moment a 7-year-old finally gets long division and looks at you like you just handed them the keys to the universe. But in the Lawson house, teaching was not a career. It was a hobby someone forgot to outgrow. Every Thanksgiving, when a relative asked what I did, my mother would answer before I could open my mouth. "She teaches," Diane would say, her voice dipping the way it did when she talked about a restaurant that had gone downhill. 3rd grade. It's sweet. Then she'd turn her whole body toward Brandon. Now, Brandon just closed a $4 million deal in Stamford. I heard that pivot, or some version of it, for 8 years. But there was one person in that family who never made me feel small, and she was about to leave me something that would change everything. The second time I realized my place in the family was my 30th birthday. I'd planned a small dinner at my apartment in Hartford. Nothing fancy, just pasta, wine, and the people I loved. I invited my parents, Brandon, his wife Karen. I cleaned for 2 days. I even bought a tablecloth. Richard and Brandon were busy golf tournament, couldn't reschedule. Diane showed up 2 hours late, handed me an envelope with $50 inside, kissed my cheek, and said, "Get yourself something nice, honey." She stayed 40 minutes. I found out the following week that she'd given Brandon a Rolex for his promotion. A Rolex. I got a card that didn't even have a handwritten note inside. But at 7 that morning, before the disappointment, before the empty chairs, my phone rang. It was Grandma Eleanor. She sang the entire happy birthday song off key and laughing the way she'd done every single year since I was born. Then she said, "You're the best thing this family ever produced, and they're too blind to see it." She'd also mailed me a tin of her homemade oatmeal cookies, the ones with the brown butter that took her all afternoon to make. Inside the tin was a handwritten card, "Keep being you. The world needs more Theas." Grandma Eleanor was 82 then, sharp as a blade, funny in the way that catches you off guard. She had this saying she repeated like scripture: "Money shows you who people really are." She also had her own money separate from the family. I didn't know how much. I didn't know where it came from. She never talked about it in detail, and I never asked. I should have asked. The call came on a Wednesday, 11 at night. I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table when my phone lit up. Richard, my father, almost never called me, and never this late. I picked up and heard a voice I barely recognized, flat, controlled, like he was reading a script. "Your grandmother passed in her sleep at the house. I don't remember hanging up. I remember putting on shoes. I remember my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice in the parking lot. I remember the highway being empty, just me and the headlights. 90 minutes of darkness between Hartford and Westport. When I got to the house, every light was on. Richard and Diane were in the kitchen. Brandon stood near the counter with his arms crossed. Nobody hugged me. Nobody said, "I'm sorry." Diane looked at me and said, "The funeral home is coming at 8. That was it. That was my welcome. I walked past them and went upstairs to her bedroom. The door was open. The lamp was still on. She looked peaceful, smaller than I remembered, like sleep had finally let her rest all the way. I sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand. It was cool, but not cold. On the nightstand was a framed photo of the two of us at the beach, me at 7, sunburned and grinning, Eleanor laughing behind oversized sunglasses. I sat there for a long time downstairs. I could hear my parents talking, not crying, not remembering, talking. Low voices, fast words, the tone people use when they're planning, not grieving. I didn't know it then, but while I was holding my grandmother's hand for the last time, my parents were already making phone calls. The funeral was 3 days later. About 60 people filled the church, neighbors, old friends, a few business associates of my father's. Eleanor had lived in Westport for 51 years. She was known. She was loved. I asked to read the eulogy. Diane said no. Brandon will handle it. She told me over the phone. The morning of "He's better with crowds," Brandon stood at the podium in a navy suit and read 4 minutes of generalities. He called Eleanor a pillar of the Lawson name. He mentioned her volunteer work with the Garden Club and her love of classic films. He did not mention the cookies she baked from scratch every Christmas. He did not mention the phone calls at 7 in the morning. He did not mention me. After the service, we went back to Eleanor's house. Diane was already in the bedroom going through the dresser drawers, sorting jewelry into labeled bags. I watched from the doorway. "What are you doing?" I said, organizing her things before the estate process. "Already?" She looked at me the way you look at a child who's asked why the sky is blue for the 10th time. Tired, annoyed, done. I stepped outside. The porch was quiet. The garden Eleanor had tended for decades was still blooming. Mom's mostly orange and stubborn. A hand touched my arm. Maggie Hole, 78 years old, Eleanor's next-door neighbor for over 40 years. She'd been at every birthday, every holiday, every hospital visit. She squeezed my hand and looked straight at me. "Your grandmother talked about you every single day," she said. Then her eyes narrowed just slightly. "She was smarter than all of them. Remember that." It sounded like a warning. Not sad, not gentle. Like she was giving me armor I didn't know I'd need. 5 days after the funeral, I called my father. I wanted to ask about the estate paperwork. I said, "Am I included in the will?" Silence. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "Mitchell's handling it," Richard said. Mitchell was the family's lawyer, Alan Mitchell. "Same firm for 20 years. You don't need to worry about that." "Am I included?" I asked again. "We'll discuss it at the reading." He hung up. I called Brandon next. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear Karen saying something in the background. "Look," Brandon said, his voice careful, "I don't know all the details, but Mom and Dad said they'd explain everything at the meeting." He knew something. I could hear it. That slight rise in pitch, the way he gets when he's holding back. Brandon was never good at lying. He was just good at staying quiet. That night, I sat at my laptop and looked up Connecticut probate law. I read about wills, amendments, and timelines. I learned that if a will is altered after someone dies and a beneficiary doesn't object in time, they can lose everything. The clock was already ticking, and I hadn't even seen the document. Then something arrived in my mailbox. A letter, thick cream-colored envelope, return address, Kessler and Webb, attorneys at law, a firm I had never heard of. Inside was a single page. It read, "Re-estate of Eleanor Lawson separate matter. You are invited to attend a reading at the offices of Alan Mitchell." On it listed the same date, same time, same address as the family reading. I read that letter 3 times. I didn't understand it, but something in my chest shifted like a lock clicking open that I didn't know was there. The night before the reading, I sat alone in my apartment. The TV was off. The windows were dark. I held a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands and stared at the photo of Eleanor on my fridge. The two of us at her kitchen table, flour on my nose, grinning like idiots. I was 9 in that picture. She was 71. We were making her brown butter cookies, and she kept pretending I was doing all the work. I thought about the last time I saw her. 2 weeks before she died, I drove down to Westport on a Saturday, made her chicken soup from scratch, and we watched Jeopardy together on her old couch. She was wrapped in her blue Afghan, calling out answers before the contestants could buzz in. Before I left, she grabbed my hand, held it tight, looked at me with those clear gray eyes. "Whatever happens," she said, "you're taken care of. Do you understand?" I thought she meant emotionally. I thought she was being a grandmother. Warm, reassuring, a little dramatic. I smiled and kissed her forehead and said, "I know, Grandma. I didn't know anything." That night, I went to my closet and pulled out the navy blazer she'd complimented the last time I wore it. "You look like a woman who knows what she's worth," she told me. I pressed it, hung it on the door handle, laid out a white blouse and slacks. I picked up the letter from Kessler and Webb and slid it into my bag. I didn't know what was in that second envelope, but I knew my grandmother, and my grandmother never did anything without a reason. I set my alarm for 6. I didn't sleep until 3. The reading was at 10 o'clock in the morning at the law offices of Alan Mitchell in downtown Westport. A second-floor conference room with a long oak table, leather chairs, and a wall of windows that let in too much light for the kind of conversation we were about to have. I arrived 10 minutes early. I was not the first. Richard sat at the head of the table like he owned the room. Diane was beside him in a black dress and pearls, her posture perfect, her hands folded. Brandon was next to Karen, his wife, who was scrolling her phone with one thumb. Greg and Laura, cousins from my uncle's side, sat near the middle, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Old Walt Fisher, Eleanor's bridge partner of 30 years, was near the window. Maggie Holt sat in the chair closest to the door. Alan Mitchell stood by a side table, organizing folders. His assistant was pouring water into glasses nobody would drink. And in the far corner of the room, sitting perfectly still, holding a brown leather envelope, was a man I had never seen before. Silver hair, gold-rimmed glasses, a dark suit that fit like it was sewn for him. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile. He just sat there, watching. I stepped inside. Diane looked me over from head to toe. Brandon nodded but didn't stand. Richard didn't look up. "She actually came," Diane murmured to Karen. She didn't bother to whisper. I walked to the far end of the table and sat down. Maggie was next to me. She touched my shoulder once lightly, then folded her hands in her lap. The man in the corner hadn't moved, but I noticed Diane glanced at him just once, then quickly look away. Mitchell cleared his throat and opened the first folder. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Lawson," he began. His voice was steady, practiced. He'd probably done this 1,000 times. The estate, valued at approximately $2.3 million, is to be divided as follows. He read the house first. The Westport property, appraised at $1.1 million, was left to Richard Lawson. Then the investment accounts, roughly $800,000, to Brandon Lawson. The jewelry collection and remaining liquid assets, approximately $400,000, to Diane Lawson. I listened for my name. I waded through every paragraph, every clause, every legal phrase that blurred together in the overhead light. My name came, not once, not in a footnote, not in a personal bequest. Nothing. The room shifted. I could feel eyes moving to me. Greg, Laura, Walt, 14 people in that room, and every one of them had heard my name missing from the document they just sat through. I kept my face still. My hands were knotted together under the table so tight my knuckles ached, but I didn't move. I didn't blink. Diane turned to me. She tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to say something she'd been rehearsing. "Don't look so surprised, Thea." The room went quiet. I looked at her, then at Mitchell, then at the folder in his hands. "I'm not surprised," I said. "I'm listening." Mitchell shifted in his chair. He glanced down at his notes and continued. "These are the terms as amended." On amended, he said amended. I filed that word away and said nothing. The moment Mitchell closed the folder, Diane spoke again. This time, she didn't turn toward me. She addressed the room. Her voice was clear, measured, the voice she used at charity galas and country club brunches. The voice that made everything sound like a reasonable opinion. "You are always her least favorite," she said. "Eleanor knew you'd just waste it. You'd probably donate it to your little school." She pressed down on the word little like she was grinding something under her heel. Nobody spoke. Brandon stared at the table. His jaw tightened, but he didn't open his mouth. Karen covered her lips with 2 fingers, and I couldn't tell if she was hiding a smile or biting back something worse. Greg frowned. Laura looked at me with the kind of expression people wear at funerals. Soft, pitying, useless. Walt shook his head slowly once. Then Maggie spoke. "That's not true, Diane." Diane's chin lifted. "Excuse me. Eleanor loved Thea and you know it." Diane's smile thinned. "Maggie, this is a family matter." Maggie didn't blink. Eleanor was my family too. The silence that followed had weight to it. You could feel it pressing on the walls. Mitchell looked down at his papers, then carefully, deliberately looked toward the man in the corner. The man in the corner set his envelope on the table. He adjusted his glasses, and then he stood up. Every head in the room turned. Diane's mouth opened, then closed. Richard shifted forward in his chair. Brandon looked at Karen, then at the man, then back at Karen like he was searching for an explanation no one had. I held my breath. "My name is Harold Kessler," the man said. His voice was calm, low, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. "I'm a senior partner at Kessler & Webb. I was retained by Eleanor Lawson 7 years ago for a separate legal matter." Richard's head snapped toward him. "I've never heard of you." "That was by design, Mr. Lawson." Diane leaned forward. "What separate matter? I'll explain in a moment." Kessler looked at Mitchell. "With your permission, Mr. Mitchell?" Mitchell nodded. There was no surprise on his face. He'd known this was coming. He'd been waiting for it. Kessler placed both hands on the envelope. He looked around the table once slowly, like a man who understood the weight of the next 30 seconds, then turned to me. "Miss Lawson," he said. "Thea." The way he said my name was gentle, but there was no softness in it. It was precise, intentional. "Your grandmother asked me to be here today specifically for you." Diane slammed her palm on the table. "Alan, what is this?" Mitchell raised one hand. "Mrs. Lawson, I was instructed by Eleanor to allow Mr. Kessler to present his materials after the primary reading. This was Eleanor's explicit wish. Documented, signed, and notarized." Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Kessler unsealed the envelope. He pulled out 2 documents, crisp and white, and laid them flat on the table. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall behind me. He looked at the first page. Then he began to read, and the room went completely silent. The kind of silent that isn't empty, but full. Full of held breath. Full of 14 people realizing at exactly the same moment that this meeting was not over. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I want to ask you something. If you were in my seat right now, what would you be thinking? Drop a 1 in the comments if you'd be terrified. Drop a 2 if you'd be hopeful. Drop a 3 if you already know exactly what Grandma Eleanor did. Let's see who figured it out. Now back to the reading. I need to go back for a moment because what happened next in that room won't make sense unless you understand something about my grandmother. 4 years before she died, I visited her on a Sunday afternoon. It was raining. She was at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, reading glasses low on her nose, a cup of black coffee at her elbow, financial documents, legal looking. She had a yellow highlighter in one hand and a pen in the other. "What's that, Grandma?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Insurance? Like health insurance?" She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from her chest. "No, sweetheart, insurance against greed." I thought she was joking. Eleanor had a dry sense of humor that could cut through steel, and half the time I didn't know if she was being funny or delivering a verdict. I let it go, made us sandwiches, watched her finish her paperwork in silence. There was one other thing. In her bedroom, on the top shelf of the closet, Eleanor kept a small wooden box. Dark cherry finish, brass latch, locked. Always locked. I noticed it years ago when I was helping her change the curtains. What's in the box, Grandma? She smiled. Not her funny smile, but the other one, the one that meant she was holding something close. That's where I keep the things that matter most. I assumed it was love letters, maybe old photos, something sentimental that a woman in her 80s might want to keep safe. I didn't ask again. She never brought it up. And sitting in that conference room 7 years later, watching Kessler smooth the documents on the table, I had no idea that both of those moments, the insurance and the box, were about to come full circle. Back in the conference room, Kessler had the documents in front of him. The room was still. Diane's hands were flat on the table. Richard's jaw was clenched so hard I could see the muscle pulsing near his ear. Brandon sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the papers in Kessler's hands like they were ticking. I reached into my bag. My fingers found the letter, the one that had arrived 5 days ago. Cream-colored heavy stock, the return address I hadn't recognized, Kessler and Webb, estate of Eleanor Lawson. Separate matter, same firm, same name, same man now standing at the far end of this table. That's when I understood my grandmother hadn't just written a will with Alan Mitchell. She'd built something else, a separate system, a separate structure, entirely outside this family's reach. She had used a different lawyer, a different firm, and she had done it in silence for years. I looked around the room. Richard was leaning forward, both hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Diane had gone pale, not the dramatic pale of someone performing shock, but the actual color draining from a face that just realized control was slipping. Brandon looked at Karen. Karen looked at the floor. Kessler cleared his throat softly. "I have here," he said, "a certified copy of an irrevocable trust established by Eleanor Grace Lawson on March 14th, 7 years ago through our firm." He paused with full capacity certification, he added, as though placing a period at the end of a sentence no one could argue with. Then he looked at Diane, then at Richard, then he turned the page. I stopped breathing. Kessler spoke the way engineers explain bridges. No emotion, just load-bearing facts. An irrevocable trust, he said, once executed cannot be altered, amended, or revoked by anyone, including the Gortor. It exists outside the probate estate. It is not subject to the will you just heard. Diane's voice came fast. What does that mean? It means this trust was never part of the estate Mr. Mitchell just read. It was established separately, funded separately, and managed by our firm for 7 years. It has its own assets, its own terms, and its own designated beneficiary. Richard's voice cracked on the first word. My mother never mentioned any trust. Kessler looked at him the way a man looks at a door he's already locked. She was under no obligation to Mr. Lawson. The room was so still I could hear someone's watch ticking. Maybe it was mine. Brandon broke first. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice tight. Who's the beneficiary? Kessler turned to me. Not a glance, not a casual look. He turned his entire body and looked directly at me. And in that moment, I understood why my grandmother had chosen him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't enjoying this. He was executing a promise he had made to a woman he respected, and he was doing it with a kind of precision that left no room for doubt. The sole beneficiary, Kessler said, is Thea Eleanor Lawson. The room exhaled. Not relief, not shock, but something in between, a sound like a held note finally being released. Diane whispered it almost to herself. How much? The clock ticked. Kessler turned the page. Kessler read it the way he read everything, evenly without decoration. The trust is valued at approximately $11,400,000. Silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. The kind that comes when a room full of people hear something so far outside their expectations that their brains need a moment to catch up. 3 seconds passed. Diane's knees gave out. She didn't faint. It wasn't that clean. She buckled sideways, grabbing the edge of the table with one hand while the chair slid beneath her. Karen reached for her arm and caught her just before she hit the floor. They lowered her into the seat, and Diane sat there, mouth open, staring at Kessler like he'd spoken a language she'd never heard. Richard didn't move. He stood frozen, one hand white-knuckled on the back of his chair. His face was the color of wet cement. "That's not possible," he said. His voice was barely audible. "That's not possible." Brandon shoved back from the table. 11 million? He was almost shouting. She left 11 million to her. Greg and Laura exchanged a look. Wide-eyed, wordless. Walt Fisher took a handkerchief from his breast pocket and pressed it to the corner of his eye. He said it softly, but everyone heard. "That's my Eleanor." Maggie Holt didn't move. She sat with her hands folded, her chin steady. She nodded once slowly, like a woman watching the final piece of a very long plan fall exactly where it was supposed to. And me? I didn't speak. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, they weren't shaking. Richard was the first to pivot. He turned on Mitchell, and his voice had the sharp edge of a man who'd spent 40 years closing deals and never once being the one left out. "Did you know about this?" Mitchell folded his hands. "I was informed this morning that Mr. Kessler would be attending, and you didn't tell me it was Eleanor's instruction, Richard." Richard's neck flushed red. He looked like he wanted to throw something, but he was too aware of the room, the witnesses, the 14 pairs of eyes recording every word. Diane stood up. Her composure was gone, her voice high and cracking. "This is fraud." She was 83 years old. She wasn't in her right mind. Kessler opened the second page of the document and turned it so the room could see. "Mrs. Lawson, Eleanor completed a full cognitive and psychiatric evaluation at the time the trust was established. I have the physician certification here." He tapped the paper once. "She was 76, fully competent. The evaluation was conducted independently and is on file with the state." Diane's jaw tightened. "I don't care. We'll contest this. An irrevocable trust is by definition uncontestable by family members who are not named beneficiaries. Your attorney can confirm that." Mitchell nodded barely, but he nodded. Brandon cut in. "This isn't fair." I looked at him. I kept my voice level, my hands still. "You just inherited $800,000, Brandon." He blinked. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at Karen, who looked at the floor. No one else spoke. The room had shifted, and everyone in it knew it. Diane changed tactics the way a weather front changes direction. Fast, invisible, and without warning. The anger drained from her face. Her shoulders softened, her eyes filled with tears that appeared so quickly, I wondered if she'd been saving them. She turned to me, reached across the table, and opened her hand. "Thea, honey," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound broken. "I know we haven't always been perfect, but we're family. Your grandmother would have wanted us to share." I looked at her hand. It was manicured, steady, extended like an offering, like forgiveness was something she was handing down. I didn't take it. "Grandma wanted exactly what she put in writing," I said. "She had 7 years to change her mind. She didn't." Diane's expression crumbled, or rather rearranged. "You're going to punish us for what? I'm not punishing anyone. I'm honoring her wishes." Richard spoke from across the table, his voice low and cold. "Your grandmother was manipulated. Someone talked her into this." Kessler didn't flinch. "Mr. Lawson, I've known Eleanor for 22 years. No one talked Eleanor into anything ever." Maggie leaned forward. "He's right. Eleanor was the sharpest person I've ever known." Richard turned on her. "This doesn't concern you, Margaret." "It does," Maggie said. She straightened her back, and her voice had a quiet steel to it that I'd never heard before. "She asked me to be here today as a witness. That landed." Greg's eyebrows went up. Laura covered her mouth. Mitchell looked at Kessler, and Kessler gave the smallest nod, a confirmation between professionals. Eleanor hadn't just planned a trust. She'd arranged an audience, and she'd cast every role. Brandon stood up. His chair scraped the floor so hard it left a mark. Karen reached for his arm. "Sit down, Brandon." "No." He pulled away. He started pacing behind his chair, one hand running through his hair, the other pressed to his hip. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like something had cracked. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "I worked for this family for 12 years. I gave up my 20s for Dad's company." I missed vacations. I gave everything to that business. He was talking to the room, but his eyes kept drifting to me. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see the golden child, the favorite, the one who got the Rolex and the corner office and the Sunday dinners designed around his schedule. I saw a 35-year-old man standing in a law office, realizing that the people who told him he was the most important person in the family had been using him as a prop. "I know you did, Brandon," I said. No sarcasm, no victory. He stared at me. His eyes were red. His voice dropped. Did she ever say anything about me? The room went still again. Even Diane stopped crying. Kessler answered before I could. His voice was gentle. The first gentleness I'd heard from him all morning. Eleanor loved all her grandchildren. "Mr. Lawson, the trust reflects a specific concern, not a ranking of affection." Richard pushed his chair back. "Enough. We're done here. We'll get our own lawyer." Kessler adjusted his glasses. "That is your right, Mr. Lawson, but I'd encourage you to consult someone familiar with Connecticut trust law before making any costly decisions." Richard said nothing. He grabbed Diane's arm and they walked out. "Okay, quick pause. I need to know, what would you do with $11.44 million if your family treated you the way mine treated me? Drop an A if you'd share some of it with them anyway. Drop a B if you'd walk away and never look back. Or drop a C if you'd set up your own trust for someone who actually deserves it. Tell me in the comments." Now here's what I actually did. The door had barely closed behind my parents when Kessler reached into the envelope one more time. "There's one more item," he said. Eleanor included a personal letter to be read aloud at this meeting. She was very specific about that aloud in front of everyone. From down the hall, I heard Diane's voice. "Alan, we're not finished." And then the front door slammed, but enough people were still in the room. Greg and Laura hadn't moved. Walt had his handkerchief pressed to his cheek. Maggie sat straight back beside me, her hand resting lightly on the arm of my chair. Brandon had come back. He was standing near the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed. Karen stood behind him. Neither had left. Kessler unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Eleanor's. I recognized the loops, the slant, the way she crossed her T's like tiny swords. He read, "Dear Thea, if this letter is being read, then I'm gone. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see the look on your mother's face." Maggie let out a laugh, short, sharp, surprised. Walt smiled through his tears. Even Greg grinned. Kessler continued, "I watched this family for 60 years. I watched your father become someone I didn't recognize. I watched your mother decide that a person's worth is measured in zeros. And I watched you choose kindness when it would have been so much easier to choose money." He paused. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "You are not the family's least favorite. You are its best, and I refuse to let them take from you what they were never willing to give. Respect." That's when the tears came. I didn't fight them. I sat up straight and let them fall. Kessler folded the letter and placed it on the table in front of me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The room was still, the kind of still that comes after something has landed. Not an explosion, but a truth so heavy that it presses everything else flat. Down the hallway, I could hear Diane. She had come back. Or maybe she'd never fully left. She was crying. But I'd lived with Diane for 18 years, and I knew the difference between her tears. These weren't regret. They were control slipping through her fingers. Her voice carried through the walls. She turned my own mother-in-law against me. Nobody in the room responded. Nobody agreed. Nobody even looked toward the door. Greg came to my side of the table. He put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad she did this, Thea," he said. "Really?" Laura nodded. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said enough. Walt stood, walked over to Kessler, and shook his hand. "Eleanor picked the right man," he said. Brandon was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. Karen tugged his sleeve and whispered, "We should go." Brandon shook his head slightly. "Give me a minute." He looked at me from across the room. He didn't speak, but something shifted in his expression. Something quiet and unfinished, like the first line of an apology that hadn't found its words yet. Kessler closed his briefcase. He turned to me. "Ms. Lawson, we can schedule a private meeting this week to go over the trust details. There's no rush. Everything is secure. Thank you, Mr. Kessler." He nodded once. Then he picked up his case and walked out with the quiet confidence of a man who had done exactly what he'd promised to do. I was standing. I don't remember deciding to stand. Diane appeared in the doorway again. Her mascara had tracked 2 lines down her cheeks. She looked smaller than usual, which made her dangerous. Diane was at her worst when she felt cornered. "Thea," she said, "can we at least talk about this as a family?" I looked at her. I thought about the Thanksgiving tables where my name was a footnote. I thought about the $50 envelope, the eulogy I wasn't allowed to give, the phone calls from my father that never came, the amended will filed before the flowers on Eleanor's casket had even wilted. I spoke clearly, not loud, not shaking, just clear. "You told me in front of everyone in this room that I was Grandma's least favorite. 30 minutes ago, you said I'd waste her money on my little school. You rewrote her will the night she died." I paused. The room was listening. "So no, Mom, we're not going to talk about this as a family, because for the last 8 years, I haven't been treated like one." Diane's mouth opened. Nothing came. I picked up my bag. I looked around the room, once at Greg, at Laura, at Walt, at Maggie, at Mitchell, at Brandon still leaning in the doorway. Then I looked at Brandon. "For what it's worth," I said, "she loved you too. She just knew you'd be okay without the money." Brandon swallowed. His eyes were wet. He nodded once, slow like it cost him something. I walked to the door. Diane didn't move to stop me. Richard was gone. The hallway was empty. I stepped through and didn't look back. I made it halfway down the hallway before my legs started to shake. The blazer felt heavy. My hands were trembling again, not with fear this time, but with the kind of release that comes after holding yourself together in a room that wanted you to break. I leaned against the wall and pressed both palms flat against the cool plaster. Thea Maggie was behind me. She walked slowly, the way she always did, deliberate, unhurried, like the world could wait. She reached me, and without a word, she pulled me into a hug. Not polite, not brief, a real hug, the kind where someone holds on because they know you need it. "She would have been so proud of you," Maggie said into my shoulder. I cried then, not the quiet tears from the conference room. This was different. This was the sob I'd been holding since 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, since the moment I held my grandmother's hand and felt it cooling. I cried into Maggie's coat and didn't care who heard. When I pulled back, Maggie was smiling. "You know," she said, "she told me about the trust 3 years ago, made me promise not to say a word. Hardest secret I ever kept." I laughed a wet, broken laugh. 3 years, Maggie. Hey, I made a promise." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key. She placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "This is for the wooden box in her bedroom," she said. "She asked me to give it to you after today." I stared at the key. I thought of Eleanor's voice. "That's where I keep the things that matter most." "What's in it?" I whispered. "Letters," Maggie said. "To you. One for every year since you started teaching." 3 days later, I sat across from Harold Kessler in his office at Kessler & Webb. It was a different world from Mitchell's firm, quieter, smaller, a wall of bookshelves, a framed oil painting of a sailboat, and the faint smell of old paper and good coffee. The kind of office where serious things were handled by people who didn't need to advertise. Kessler laid out the trust documents across his desk. The trust includes a portfolio of blue-chip equities, 2 rental properties in New Haven, both owned by Eleanor prior to her marriage, and a brokerage account she funded over the past 2 decades. Total current value $11.4 million. I stared at the numbers. They didn't feel real. "She set this up," Kessler said when she saw the direction things were going. "She told me, and I'm quoting directly, 'My son is becoming his father, and my granddaughter is the only one who isn't.'" I closed my eyes. I could hear her voice in those words. "Did she consider including Brandon?" I asked. "She did, but she concluded that Brandon would receive adequate support from Richard and Diane. You would not. She was concerned, and specifically that you would be excluded entirely. He said it without judgment, just fact. He pushed a folder toward me. This contains the asset detail, the disbursement schedule, and a recommendation for a financial advisor our firm trusts. There's no pressure. You can take whatever time you need. I looked at the folder. My hands were shaking again. I'm a teacher, Mr. Kessler. I don't know how to manage this, he smiled. The first full smile I'd seen from him. That's exactly why Eleanor chose you, she said. Anyone who'd choose a classroom over a boardroom has the right priorities. I drove back to Hartford that evening with the folder on the passenger seat untouched like it might bite. Over the next 2 weeks, I made decisions slowly, carefully, the way Eleanor would have. I kept the trust intact. I didn't pull out a dime beyond what I needed to set up a meeting with the financial advisor Kessler recommended, a woman named Sandra Reyes, who specialized in long-term wealth preservation and didn't flinch when I told her I made $46,000 a year. I kept teaching. Same school, same classroom, same 22 third graders who still couldn't remember the difference between there, and there. I set aside $200,000 to create a scholarship fund at my school. I named it the Ella Lanner Lawson Scholarship for students from families that couldn't afford school supplies, field trips, or the things that make a kid feel like they belong. The principal cried when I told her I almost did, too. I kept the 2 rental properties in New Haven, steady, modest income. The kind of investment Eleanor believed in. Not flashy, just reliable. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't move. I didn't post anything on social media. I didn't call anyone to brag. I drove my 2017 Honda Civic to work every morning, and I came home every night to a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like coffee and red pen ink. The only people I told were Maggie and 2 colleagues at school, women I trusted, women who understood. Then I wrote an email. Short, clear, final. I will not be contesting the original will. The trust is a separate matter and will remain as Grandma intended. I wish you well, but I need space. Please respect that. I hit send. I turned off my phone. Diane called 7 times in the first 2 days. I didn't answer. I let the voicemails pile up like a record of everything I'd already spent 31 years hearing. The first one was rage. You're tearing this family apart, Thea. Your grandmother would be ashamed. The third was tears. I'm your mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? The 7th was ice. You'll regret this. Mark my words. I saved them all, not out of spite, out of clarity. When you've spent your whole life wondering if you're the problem, it helps to hear the proof that you're not. Richard sent 1 text, 4 words. Call your mother. I didn't reply. Brandon sent 1 too. I get it. Take your time. Short, quiet, no demands. I didn't respond, but I read it twice. Something in those 5 words felt honest in a way nothing from that family had felt in years. In Westport, the news traveled the way news travels in small money towns. Not through headlines, but through glances. Through conversations at the country club that stopped when Richard walked in. Through Maggie, who didn't spread gossip, but who also didn't lie when someone asked what happened at the reading. 2 of Eleanor's longtime friends stopped inviting Diane to their book club. A business associate of Richard's, a man named Gavin who'd known Eleanor since the 80s, pulled Richard aside at the golf club. I heard about it later secondhand through Maggie. That's a bad look, Rick. Gavin told him 6 words. But in Westport, reputation is currency, and the Lawson account was running a deficit. I didn't celebrate any of this. I didn't track it. I just went to work every morning, came home every night, and let the silence do what silence does. 6 weeks after the reading, the consequences were no longer whispers. They were numbers. Diane hired her own attorney, a litigator from Stamford, who charged $400 an hour. He reviewed the trust documents for 2 weeks, consulted with a probate specialist, and came back with a 1-page summary that amounted to 3 words: no legal basis. The trust was airtight, established 7 years ago, independently certified, irrevocable, separate from the estate. There was nothing to contest, no standing to claim, and no path forward that wouldn't end in sanctions. Diane spent $15,000 to hear the word no. Richard's firm started bleeding. Not dramatically, not a collapse, not a scandal, just a slow, steady retreat. 2 longtime clients, both of whom had known Eleanor personally, quietly moved their business to another agency. Neither called to explain. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. At home, Brandon and Karen were fracturing. Karen wanted Brandon to push harder, to hire lawyers, to make claims, to fight for what she called our share. Brandon started pushing back. Maybe Mom and Dad went too far, he told her. One night, she slept in the guest room for a week. Meanwhile, at my school, the Eleanor Lawson Scholarship was approved by the district board. 4 students were selected for the first round of funding, 2 for school supplies, 1 for a summer reading program, and 1 for a music camp she couldn't otherwise afford. Her name was Lily. She was 8. When I told her she'd been chosen, she hugged me so hard her backpack swung around and hit me in the knee. I thought about Eleanor, about what she'd said all those years ago. Money shows you who people really are. She was right. It also shows you what you can become. 2 months after the reading, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer, but the name on the screen wasn't Mom or Dad. It was Brandon. I let it ring 3 times, then I picked up. "I'm not calling to ask for money," he said. His voice was tired. Not the tired of a long day, the tired of someone who's been arguing with himself for weeks and finally lost. "Okay," I said. A pause. I heard him exhale. Somewhere behind him, a door closed. I just wanted to say I should have stood up for you at the reading, and before that, for years, I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit between us, not to punish him, but because I'd learned that silence is where the truth has room to breathe. "I'm not blaming Mom and Dad for everything," he continued, "but I see it now. The way they treated you, how I benefited from it, I was part of that." "Yes," I said. "You were." Another pause. Longer this time. "Can we start over?" he asked. Not as the Lawson kids, just as brother and sister. I looked at the photo of Eleanor on my fridge, the flower on my nose, the grin. "I don't know yet, Brandon, but I'm glad you called." He didn't push. He didn't bargain. He just said, "Okay, that's enough for now." We hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. I didn't call him back. I didn't text a follow-up. I didn't forgive him on the spot because forgiveness isn't something you hand out like a hall pass. It's something you grow into slowly, honestly, when you're ready and not a second before. But the door was open, and that was enough. That evening, I drove to Westport. Eleanor's house was still in probate, empty, locked, waiting for the estate process to grind through. But Maggie had a spare key. She always had. I let myself in. The house smelled like dust and lavender, which was Eleanor's scent. Not perfume, just the sachets she kept in every drawer. The hallway was dark. The kitchen clock had stopped. I climbed the stairs and went into her bedroom. It looked the same as the night she died. The blue Afghan folded on the bed, the lamp on the nightstand, the photo of us at the beach. I opened the closet. There it was, the wooden box on the top shelf. Dark cherry finish, brass latch. I took it down and sat on the edge of her bed, the same spot where I'd held her hand. The key Maggie had given me fit perfectly. Inside were 8 envelopes. Each one had a year written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting, starting with the year I began teaching, ending with the year she died. I opened the first one. "Dear Thea, today you started your first day of teaching. Your father didn't call. Your mother told me she was embarrassed. But I want you to know I have never been more proud of anyone in my life. You chose what matters. Keep choosing it. Love, Grandma." I read every letter one by one, 7 years of her voice, her humor, her fierce and steady love, all written in a hand that grew shakier with each envelope, but never lost its clarity. The last letter was dated 3 months before she died. "Dear Thea, this is probably my last letter. My hands don't work as well anymore, but I want you to know everything is ready. You are taken care of, not because you need it, but because you deserve it. Love always, Grandma." I sat on the floor of her bedroom and held those letters to my chest, and I cried. Not because I'd lost her, but because I finally understood how completely I had been loved. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry at my parents. The honest answer is sometimes. In the small hours when the apartment is quiet and I'm staring at the ceiling, I still feel the heat of Diane's voice saying least favorite in front of a room full of people. I still hear the silence where my father should have spoken up and didn't. I don't think those memories go away. I think you just learn to carry them differently. But mostly, I'm grateful. Not to them, to her. I haven't spoken to my parents in 3 months. That's not revenge. That's peace. I don't owe them my presence just because we share a last name. Silence isn't punishment. Sometimes it's the healthiest thing you can choose. I still teach. Same school, same kids. I drive the same Honda Civic with the coffee stain on the passenger seat. And the reading is my superpower bumper sticker. One of my students made me. The money didn't change who I am, but it changed what I can do for myself and for kids who remind me of who I was at 7 years old, sitting on a beach with the one person who saw me. 4 students received the Eleanor Lawson Scholarship in the first round. 4 kids who will go to music camp, get new backpacks, join the summer reading program. 4 kids who will know, even if they don't know the whole story, that someone believed in them. My grandmother couldn't protect me while she was alive. Not from them, not in the ways that mattered day to day. But she did the next best thing. She made sure that when they finally showed who they were in front of witnesses on the record with no room to rewrite the story, I'd have something to stand on. And I do. I keep the letters in a fireproof safe now. Not because I'm afraid of losing them. I've memorized most of them anyway, but because they're proof. Proof that someone in my family loved me the right way, quietly, consistently, without conditions. Last week, I went back to Eleanor's house one more time. The probate process is almost done. Richard will get the house as the will says. I don't need it. I never did. I walked through the garden. The mums she planted are still there. Orange, stubborn, blooming without anyone telling them to. I sat on the porch swing she used to sit in every evening, the one where she'd read her mystery novels and drink tea and wave at Maggie across the fence. I thought about what I'd tell her if I could call her one more time at 7 in the morning. I'd tell her thank you, not for the money, although that changed my life in ways I'm still understanding, but for the letters, for the cookies, for the birthday songs sung off key, for the way she looked at me like I was already everything I was meant to be. If you're watching this and you have someone like that in your life, a grandmother, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend who sees you when no one else does, call them today. Right now, if you can tell them what they mean to you, because my biggest regret isn't the years I spent being invisible to my parents. It's that I didn't say thank you enough while she was still here to hear it. You don't need everyone to see your worth. You just need one person who refuses to let anyone take it from you. For me, that was Eleanor. I hope you find yours. That's my story. Now, I want to hear yours. Drop a 1 in the comments if you've ever had a family member who protected you when no one else did. Drop a 2 if you've had to set a boundary with your own family. And drop a 3 if you're still waiting for your moment. If you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked a few that hit just as hard.